Hello and welcome to ClearPix Cool Talks. On this series about architecting data solutions with Microsoft Fabric, today in this second episode, we will be covering security and Fabric Workspaces organization. I'm Marcel Lopez, a principal BI consultant. On this session, we will be covering a brief introduction of the main features that Fabric provides, and then we will go over a use case overview where we can explain a pretty common situation that you can encounter and how to deal with it. We will explain step by step on a real demonstration how you can build that on a Fabric environment. And after that, we will just wrap up and go to conclusions about the pros and cons of this solution. So in our last video, we dove deep into medallion architecture at Fabric, exploring how to organize data into bronze, silver, and gold layers for efficient and scalable processing. We based our solution in a metadata approach, which is a very interesting approach to bring your ETL to the next level. If you miss it, be sure to check it out. And it's foundational for what we are discussing today. But today we will be focusing on an equally critical aspect. It's security in Microsoft Fabric and access control through Workspace in this case. So this is for protecting sensitive information and enabling the secure collaboration across teams. So let's unpack how Fabric ensures that security and what you need to know to implement it. First, let's cover the main features that each of the different ways you can store data on a Microsoft Fabric environment enables you to secure or to manage access control. First of all, we have the data lakehouse, where you can use the role-based access control. It's a new feature that is actually in preview, where you can build access control based on Active Directory groups or users on your OneLake. So you can decide which parts of the OneLake are accessible, and this goes through also the workspace accesses and shortcuts. Then we have SQL permissions through SQL endpoint, where you can create, grant, and delete statements on SQL, and you can add this layer of security access to your lakehouses. On the other hand, we have the data warehouse, where you can also create these grant and delete statements on SQL, and you can also build row-level access control or object-level access control. And you can also make use of data masking, where you can protect your sensitive fields on a data warehouse and partially or fully obscure from unauthorized users. And finally, we have the semantic model access control, where you can also apply role level security or object level security. And well, this feature is much well known from previous Fabric Power BI environments. But there is a drawback on all these features, and that is mainly they only apply if you are a viewer to the workspaces that these roles are being applied. And if all your resources are on the same workspaces, then these users are not going to be able to create their own products, and they will only have read access, or if they have the appropriate role, let's say member or contributor to the workspace, then all these security features are not going to be applied to the user. So how can we solve that? And this is where Microsoft proposes to divide your resources and access of your organization using Workspace. So in each workspace, you have or you can allocate the resources depending on the access and the type of team you are dealing with. This is also important because when you have different workspace, you can decide to isolate the computing and the billing costs of the executions you do on the workspace. And this is pretty important to divide capacities between different teams and enables you to exactly have a better control on your billings and your resources. Of course, there are many ways on how you can build that. You can put it everything on the same workspace, which is a possibility, like the one we explained in the first video of this series. But in many cases, you will prefer to just divide the different layers of the medallion architecture or the architecture you have on your organization based on workspace, so you can enable different teams to have different kind of accesses to the resources you have on your Fabric environment or even on the One Lake. And this drives me to our use case. So which is the use case we are going to be explaining on this webinar? It's a common scenario that we come across pretty frequently is that a central data team develops and creates enterprise-wide datasets, which are utilized for reporting purposes or maybe in artificial intelligence modelings. And one assumption is that the data team are responsible for managing the access of this data. And in this use case, we will have the data engineering team, which is the owner of the main data of the whole organization. And then they will to share different kind of data to two different type of teams. One is the data analyst, where they just want to use SQL or maybe even create semantic models from this data. And they also may have the requirement to include their own specific data sets or create their own specific aggregations. And on the other hand, we have the data scientist team, where they will have different kind of needs. They will prefer to have Spark access to the lakehouse data to create artificial intelligence models and maybe to generate some output from it using Microsoft Fabric capacities on AI. So this is what we are going to cover, and we will try to resolve this using a very important feature in Fabric and the One Lake, which are the shortcuts and the row-based access control. So let's go now into a bit more detail on our use case. The dataset we'll be using is the Adventures work. It's a pretty well-known standard for demonstration and testing. It's an ERP built on a dimensional way with fact tables and dimensional tables. And for the requirements, of course, we will need a Fabric capacity. In this case, we will be using only one capacity for this demonstration, but as I mentioned, it's a good practice to divide your capacities depending on teams and needs. So you have a better control on the expenses and the capacity usage. Of course, we will need 3 workspaces, one for each team, an admin role that will be from the data engineering team, and a collaborator role to validate that the accesses we are providing are correct. So let's go now and let me show you how you can achieve this on Microsoft Fabric. All right, so here we are. We are on our data engineering workspace where the data has already been loaded to our data lake. So let's take a look on how this data looks like. As you can see here, we have many different tables on a dimensional way where we can find currency rates, finance data, internet sales, reseller sales, and all the derived dimensions on a model that is focused on selling and data products. So this is how it looks like. Just a quick note that we use a pipeline to ingest all this data on our lakehouse. And first, we'll go over the data analyst use case part. So which are the common requirements we can encounter for data analyst team? It's that they will need to read some specific tables. They will prefer use SQL more than PySpark or notebooks. They need to build reports using Power BI, and maybe some more technical power users might want to create their own tables based on queries. And some even can want to add their own data sources. And that's where we will create a derived data warehouse where they can do that and have their own control. So first of all, what we need to do is we need to create or go to the data analyst workspace, and this must be done by somebody that has admin role level. So first, we must create the data analyst lakehouse, and on this data analyst lakehouse, we will create shortcuts to the data engineering lakehouse where the delta tables have been created. This has already been done, but let me show you how you can achieve that. You just need to create a new shortcut, access to the one lake, and in here you will see that I have the different lake houses on or one lake that I have access to it. And I will go over our bronze layer where all these tables have been created. And as you can see here, I'm able to see all the tables, but for this use case, I will only provide to some specific entities from this lakehouse and model. So this has already been done. And as you can see here, these shortcutted tables have been created. But how can we demonstrate that this is working and users from the data analyst team lakehouse have access to this data and ensure that it has been built properly? So as you can see here, and as the default process in Fabric, when you create a lakehouse, there is also created an SQL endpoint for this lakehouse. And here's where I need to change and go to the collaborator role of a data analyst, that in this case, we have our colleague Marta that will be helping us on it. So as you can see here, I'm logging on Marta user, and she have access to this lakehouse, sorry, to this workspace. And now we will check if she can see data through the SQL endpoint, which is one of our requirements to enable them to see the necessary lakehouse tables on an SQL way. So as you can see, tables are available on the SQL endpoint, and she can query the data within the tables. All right, so you can see that the information on the lakehouse is open for Marta, but she cannot see all the other tables that are also on the source lakehouse. But how can we achieve that they are also available to build new queries? Of course, you can create views on these lakehouse, but they may also want to add their own data or have their own environment to configure security access control, and then from it build some data models or share some reports to your organization. So for that, we need to build a warehouse. And let me also remember an important matter on this is that when accessing shortcuts through Power BI semantic models or Transact SQL, the calling user identity is not passed through the shortcut target path. The calling item owner's identity is passed instead, delegating access control to the calling user. So what does it mean? It means that when Marta uses SQL or semantic model using these shortcuts, the identity that Fabric will be using to access to the source lakehouse, to the source data on Delta tables on our one lake, will be mine, will be in this case Marcel's data engineering, the access control that will be passed through the system. And that's why you need, in case you need more data access control, to add this grant or deny access to the SQL point or to the data warehouse to provide the proper security on your data. And this is something you need to take into account when building these solutions. But let's go now to the data warehouse. So we already created that. As you can see here, we built an SQL query that generates new aggregations or new data entities that they will prefer to use for their reporting matters, or even they can add new data to this data warehouse, loading, I don't know, let's say CSV files or different tables that are not coming from the data engineering lakehouse. And yeah, and that's it. Doing that, we provided for all the necessities they can have. As you can see here, this product subcategory aggregation, it's already built, and it's built by Marta, not by any data engineering team, and she can check and use this data for their own purposes. And it's something that it hasn't been built by other team, and they have managed and control of it. Lastly, I would like also to show you that Marta has access through the SQL endpoint, but she won't be able to access directly to the one lake using Spark. So he has limited access to the lakehouse, and she only will be able to read data from this original lakehouse, and it's not going to be able to interact with notebooks or Spark through it. And these kind of situations, it's the one that we'll be covering on the next use case example with the data scientist team. As you can see here, we are trying to use a notebook with Marta's user, read the information on the lakehouse, and it's not available for her. Okay, so let's wrap up about this first phase of our demonstration. Let's cover the requirements. Our data analysis team needed to have access to some specific data on our OneLake. They preferred to use SQL as a language for coding data. They wanted to create some reports using Power BI, and they also wanted to have their own environment to create new data entities or new data products, and even include their own sources. And how we did that? First of all, we shared the data on our OneLake and the data engineering team with an administrator role, creating a shortcut to the data analyst lakehouse. And after that, we created a warehouse, and using the functionality on Fabric that is cross database queries between lakehouses, endpoints, and warehouses, it's possible to run queries on a lakehouse and store this data to a warehouse and create new data products or aggregations on a different level with different ownership. So yeah, this is our first use case, but let's go now to the second part of this demonstration, which will be the data and science case. So first, let's review what are the requirements for this team. And the first is that they also need to have access to some specific tables, which may be different than the one that the data analyst team have. And they also prefer to use Python and Spark for data exploration and building out new machine learning models. So for doing that, what we will be using is the role-based access control method. And let me explain that this is a public preview. So first of all, what we need to do is to share the bronze lakehouse to Marta. And this step is just to ensure that he has visibility on this item. And what we should do here is just grant access to the data analyst team. In this case, we will be sharing it to Marta, but let me say that a really good practice is to share all your information using access groups, not to a specific identities. So once this is done, I mean, we already did it, but you just need to include in here the user. Then you still need to do some more steps. First of all, on the source lakehouse, you need to open it and go to the manage OneLake data accesses. Let me remember you that this should be done also by an admin role on the data engineering team. So we open this, we click this button, and as you can see here, there are several roles already created on this lakehouse. First, we have the default one that it just provides read capacity, but we already created the data scientist one. So in this role, we decided which are the data entities that we want to share. And in this case, we are only going to be sharing the fact internet sales for them to build new machine learning models to predict maybe sellings on our company and have a better targets for next year. And yeah, and after that, once this is created, you can assign people to the role with specific permissions. In this case, we granted Marta the read permission, but again, in a more real situation, I will recommend to use global roles, not specific identity roles. So when this is done, the data engineering team has finished his working here. So now we can go back to Marta's session and see what the data scientist team should do in here. So, all right, here we are. And now we are a part of data scientist team. And first of all, we will create a lakehouse on our workspace. And on this lakehouse, what we should do is just create a new shortcut. And in this shortcut, we will have the required permissions. And how you can do that? Well, it's just the same step. You just need to create a new shortcut. But just let me remember that now we are on the scope of the data scientist team. And when we try to access to this, we have different kind of accesses. And if we go to the source lakehouse, as you can see here, we only have access to the fact internet sales, which is the access that has been granted with our role. And let me also remember a very different functionality compared with the previous case, that in this case, when you query this data, Lakehouses does not use the delegated access model and passes the calling user's entity to the one lake. So this means that you need to provide specific accesses when you want your users to interact with your one lake with Spark or notebooks. And yeah, I mean, we can have a look on the data and make sure that the data scientist team has access to it. So here we are. All the information has been loaded on a preview mode, and you can see that the data scientist team have access to the internet sales data. But our requirements were that they have the capacity to work with notebooks and use PySpark or different coding languages to build machine learning models. So, well, just as an example, we just created a quick load on this shortcut table. And you can see that using a Spark, we are able to read this table, and all this information is actually coming from the data engineering lakehouse stored in the one lake. So there's no duplicity on data, and we are just sharing using the shortcut functionalities through different workspaces, teams, and permissions. So let's go back to our presentation and wrap up the conclusions on this case. So our requirements were to grant access to some specific tables from the data engineering team and enable our data scientist team to use Python and Spark for data exploration and using notebooks on the Fabric environment to build new solutions like a machine learning model. So how we achieve that? We provide a single item sharing of the lakehouse on the data engineering workspace. And we also grant access using the role-based access control to the data scientist team and created a specific role for them with only accessing to the data they needed and we wanted to provide. And after that, we just created a lakehouse on the data scientist team to enable them to access to the data and work with it using notebooks. So let's wrap up and go to the conclusions of this demonstration. First, before starting any development, I will take into consideration different subjects. I think that you need to understand the usage that you will be giving to the data and the different data products developed on your platform. And you need to understand how this information is going to be used and how you would like to distribute that. Maybe you would like to use SQL endpoints, or you prefer semantic models, or you just don't have that many needs on securing your data. And very related to that, you need to understand how your organization is distributed, how many teams do you have, how you want to share information, and how you want to deal with access control. And once this is all clear, then you can start defining your architecture and how many workspaces and fabric capacities you will need to achieve your requirements. Another important consideration is the layout and SQL endpoint access mode. Let me just remember to you that SQL endpoints and Power BI, when using shortcutted tables on the lakehouse, use delegate access mode. So make sure you properly understand and build it correctly on your platform so you don't provide access to data that your users may not be accessing to. Another important consideration is that the workspace roles have to be taken into account, and you need to provide proper accesses to your users and building it with the considerations we mentioned during this video, like for example, taking into account that collaborators or members are not going to have applied the access control that you just generate on the workspace there have these roles applied. And last but not least, one-leg security and tenant configuration must be administered by the platform team and should be done additionally and in parallel on what we have been discussing on this webinar. So that's it. Thank you for joining us. Drop your questions and thoughts in the comments and we will come back to you with some answers. Stay tuned for next webinars and series and see you next time.